Hi there, welcome to the Rose Terrace. This area is adjacent to the main house and was used by Alice Hay, who's John Hay's daughter-in-law, to build her ornate rose gardens. We see that the generation after John Hay, comprised primarily of his son Clarence Hay and Clarence's wife Alice Hay, were really active in the way the grounds were kept in terms of what plants were grown here. So horticulture is just the types of plants that we decide to grow in our gardens and on our lawns. And I want to explore a little bit about how the implications of what types of plants were grown here indicate different societal norms for people in New England at this time. So together, the two Hays refined the house and grounds between around 1915 and 1940. They transformed rocky pastures into rolling lawns and ornamental gardens. Clarence built the gardens in the walled garden north of the estate, which is over here. And his work is in part inspired by Gertrude Jekyll, Beatrix Farrand, and Marianne Coffin, who, if you'll notice, are three women. So eventually I'm going to talk about two of them and highlight how they had different positionality that allowed them to rise to the height of horticultural society. But I also want to mention that the Rose Terrace here was the pride of Alice Hay. So we see that she had fruit trees, wisteria, and climbing hydrangea. She was looking for European classicism with her colorful rose beds. Now, down below, Clarence Hay makes his alpine garden in 1929. He states that there is more joy to be found in one rare plant that has survived a New England winter than in 99 of the commoner varieties that thrive without special attention. So there was definitely value in keeping plants that weren't native to this area alive. However, we also see a growing trend that they liked to include native plants in their landscapes. This is in part from the Cornish colony, which is from Cornish, New Hampshire, which is a little bit up the road, where people saw a popular principle of juxtaposing the natural and the formal in garden design, in part to see that balance between the civilized and the uncivilized or natural world. Now, we see certain horticultural norms emerge in the early 1900s in New England. Gertrude Jekyll, who has in part inspired the Hay Gardens, loved to use radiant colors and brush-like strokes of paintings. She went to the South Kensington School of Art in England and used warm and cool flowers. She was a medalist from the Royal Horticultural Society and Massachusetts Horticultural Society, and she was an early proponent of natural planting. We see Beatrix Farrand is often touted as the American equivalent of Jekyll. She was the only female founding member of the American Society of Landscape and Architecture. She had a really formal education with an arboretum with a Harvard professor. Her family was an elite and summered on Mount Desert Island up in Maine. She designed gardens for the elite and for private universities, including Yale. She liked to have an elegant and restrained style, but still advocated for natural palettes, in part influenced by her formative years living out on MDI, which had a lot of value for the natural space. So we see her story is really influenced by her formative years and where she lived out in had access to wilderness spaces. I think it's also interesting to note that the role of women in high society allowed them to do horticultural work. And in fact, it was in part inspired by a Victorian value in like the Renaissance man or woman to say that one should be able to maintain a beautiful property and that they should have a very high say in what occurred here. Nobody currently lives in the homestead that was once occupied by the Hay family. However, their history and how this land came to be preserved in such a wonderful way is really fascinating. As you can see around me, this flower bed has taken a lot of care and money to preserve it and to keep it at such a beautiful level. Additionally, all the hiking trails are really well maintained. So that begs the question, how did an estate go into being a protected land that could be accessible to the general public? This in part has to do with the choices made by Clarence Hay and his son. In 1960, they bequeathed 675 acres of woodland on the east side of New Hampshire Route 103A to the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests, which, if you'll remember, was really important in creating Mount Sunapee State Park. Clarence dies in 1969, and in 1978, Alice bequeaths another 164 acres to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So that's where we started our tour, was actually the land that's managed by Fish and Wildlife. Alice lives on the remaining 143 acres, including the summer house, garage, gate, and lodge for her own use during her lifetime. This tract of 164 acres is now the parcel that was nominated and listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So that's what's currently being taken care of by the Fells. The grounds of the Fells are taken care of by different horticultural societies and volunteers that every year work really hard to preserve this beautiful space. This really unique space has over 400 years of really interesting history that has really shown how different actors guided the different choices of the people who came after them. However, the space is not so different from any other space in that it has a really rich history. I really encourage you to think about the political ecology and history that influenced the land that you are currently on now. And I also want you to think about those beautiful preserved spaces that you get to enjoy. Why do those exist? How do they exist? And who once owned them? In these beautiful wilderness spaces, it's often easy to believe that humans never had a role, to believe that these spaces have always been a place devoid of human interaction. However, their history and merely the story of how they came to be preserved is often a story about people, not about forestry. I want you to think about what has brought you to your land, and if the trees could see, what would they bear witness to? And if they could speak, what would be their testimony? Thank you for coming along with my tour. I hope this left you with more questions than answers and allows you to explore as the weather gets nice outside. Thanks, guys.